from Professional Podcasts. So today I'm going to ride solo as I discuss an important topic, one of the most important topics, I think, within the functional movement space, and that's references for rotation. So when I refer to rotation here, I'm going to be referring to a full body rotation where we're going to be looking at different relationships, push-pull relationships with one side versus the other, or loading unloading relationships versus one side or the other. That's going to encompass a variety of joint motions that will be within the transverse plane. So if you think about it, there's three planes in the body. There's the front and back plane, which is the sagittal plane, which we do flexion extension with. Then there would be more of the frontal plane where we move our arms and legs out to the side and bring them back in. And then the rotation tends to happen in the transverse plane. So if we cut the body in half, that's how we're thinking about the motion is going to be in that sort of plane that's horizontal with the ground. The discussion here, though, I don't want it to be too lost in the weeds with going in depth with one joint at a time and looking at rotation, but more understanding some easier to understand references that can help us understand what we might be limited with when it comes to our rotation, and just even having a different definition in our head of how we think about rotation. So most functional movements, sport-related movements, have some type of reciprocal rotational component that really needs to be owned to maximize or optimize the efficiency. All right, so when we define rotation, we can look at it in a couple different ways, but one, as I alluded to earlier, would be a reciprocal push-pull relationship. So we're pulling our body to one side where we're going to be weight-bearing to that side typically, and then reciprocally we're pushing away from the other side. So we'll have some compressive muscular action and compressive joint action that's pulling us to the side of the body. So if we want to bear more weight on our left side, we're going to pull ourselves toward that side while we're pushing away with the opposite side. So we're pushing ourselves more to that left side. All right. We could also look at it as a reciprocal loading and unloading relationship. So as we pull to a side, we're pulling towards a more loaded side while we're pushing away and unloading a side. Right. So there's going to be different references and different terminology that we use depending on which definition we're going to be thinking of. But ultimately, these definitions, they intertwine with each other depending on how we want to cue the body and what exercise or what movement we're doing. All right, so a few references for thinking about pulling. We could start at the hip with the general idea is to think about pulling the hip into the socket. That's a good starting point because the hip is such a central part of the body. But it really does depend on what action we're doing. So specifically when we're, say, standing, weight bearing, we're trying to work on positions of walking, this idea of pulling into the socket could teach us how to get more on a side, more weight bearing, or more loaded through a side. So when we do that, there's going to be a couple of different muscular references that we might feel. So the abs, the abdominal wall on the same side that we're pulling towards should be active. And when that happens, that basically is going to bring the rib cage closer to the pelvis on that side. So specifically the muscles that are really involved there are the internal obliques, which is one of the abdominal muscles. We're also going to try to feel the inner thigh as if the knee is pulling into the groin. So it's like a zipper on that side, pulling us towards that side. The other connection will then be to the high hamstring, and the high hamstring attaches to the sit bone or the ischial tuberosity. So feeling muscular effort around that area, and oftentimes it'll feel like we're doing a subtle pelvic tilt to get that action going on. So if we're standing, a lot of times we have to have a soft knee on that side as we pull towards that side. So you feel the same side abs, the inner thigh, the back of the thigh, but usually towards that sit bone, the high hamstring. And then if we're looking at some upper body movements to pull towards the side, we might pull the shoulder into the socket, pack the shoulder. The lat or the latissimus dorsi is going to be involved. So typically, pulling actions are going to be enhanced by an exhale as well. So if we are thinking about exhaling as we tighten the same side abs, we pull the hip into the socket, all of these muscle contraction can get enhanced as we're doing a row and pulling something towards our body. Our lat gets more involved, and it's enhanced with that exhalation as the exhale tends to help compress the abdomen a little bit more and get more abdominal engagement. References for pushing or pushing away from a side would be the opposite side glute max, so the outer buttock. That is a major external rotator. So we're pushing away from that side. So to get our glute max to fire the most, and there's a lot of exercises out there to try to get your glutes to fire, there has to be some idea of pushing the body away, right? So for a glute bridge, where oftentimes both feet are planted, there's a sense of pushing our butt away from the ground. But where our feet are really matter. There's a lot of people that don't feel their glutes well when they try to do a bridge because their back gets involved too much. They don't have a good foundation of what they're doing with their feet. So there's a sense of, in this case, when we're talking about rotation, that we're using the glute to push the body away from the side that we would be engaging that glute. So if we're too heavy through that side, it might actually get in the way of our glute firing the way we want to. So that, again, there's this push-pull relationship. So opposite side glute max pushes us towards the other side where we can feel the same side, inner thigh, hamstring, internal obliques, like I mentioned. So because when we're going towards the side, pulling towards the side, we're feeling those internal obliques. We'll feel the external obliques on the other side. So basically the abdominals work, the obliques work, where whatever the internal obliques are doing on one side, the opposite side external obliques are working. So the external obliques push us to the other side, basically from the abdomen. It creates that opposite or contralateral rotation. Up higher in the body, the pushing or reaching muscle of the upper extremity is the serratus anterior, which is a muscle that you might feel underneath the armpit, but you feel it in a very different way than you might feel the lat on the other side, where with the lat, you're sort of feeling like you're pulling the shoulder into the socket. You're going to still feel engagement under the armpit because the lat is a very big muscle, but it spans into the armpit. On the other side, the serratus attaches under the shoulder blade and goes into the rib cage. So a lot of times what you're going to feel is a movement of the shoulder blade gliding along the rib cage and a feeling of maybe a little bit of a stretch under the armpit. All right, so but that's going to be your upper body reaching muscle, or one of the major ones. And there are certainly other muscles involved. And I'm not trying to make this too anatomical, but I want you to get a sense of where the general region in the body is. So with the opposite side glute max, that's the outer buttock. With the same side external obliques, that's going to just be in the abdomen on that side that we're moving away from. The serratus anterior is just going to be a feeling of some tension under the armpit, maybe into the front of the rib cage. And then all of these things will tend to be enhanced with an inhalation. So as we breathe in, this idea of pushing and reaching can be synonymous terms in this case, that tends to help us elongate more and move away from a side. So we're using that elongation on a side to be a pusher so we can get heavier on the other side. Some references for loading. Now, as we do pull ourselves to a side, we may be trying to, if our foot is on the ground, pull ourselves towards the outer heel. So the more we can get to the outer heel of the foot, that's sort of the maximum that we can load the foot. If we're more towards the inside of the foot, we're not going to be very strong if we're putting a lot of weight through that inside of the foot. So we want to feel like we get to that outer heel. The structure of the foot is much sounder as we get more to the outer heel. That corresponds to more supination of the foot as we're basically falling back into that side. So one of the differences we can think about if we're talking about pushing and pulling versus loading and unloading is loading and unloading tends to have more of a falling or propelling type of action, where pushing and pulling may have a little bit more of a muscular action or more of a muscular cue. And both are going to be really important depending on what exercise we're doing, how static the movement is. As the movement gets more dynamic, a lot of times the less muscular cueing and more cueing for references for posture and how we're falling in relation to gravity become more useful. So when we're talking about loading and unloading, the relationships to gravity and what direction we're falling become very important. So as we're being pulled towards one side, we are going to progressively also fall towards the outer heel to get some contact there. As we fall towards that outer heel, we don't want to lose the inside of the foot completely, but we just want to feel like we're putting a little bit more weight towards the outer heel. If the hands are on the ground during some type of crawling action, we might feel like we're feeling more of the pinky side of the wrist, the proximal hand. There's a bone called the pisiform that sticks out on that proximal side of the hand. We might put more pressure towards that. That is going to allow us to be loading that side a little bit more. So we might pull towards that side, and then we'll feel more load into that side of the hand. As we move up the chain, the back of the belt, so it depends on what position we're in. If we have our back against the wall or against the chair, the more the back of the belt, or the PSIS, the posterior superior iliac spine, which is just the bony prominences that you can feel sort of around on each side of where the back of the belt would be. The more we feel the one side that we're trying to move towards against the chair, then we tend to be loading more towards that side. That also moves that side posterior or behind the opposite side. So that's another way to look at it. We get more pressure on the back of the belt side that we're trying to move towards, but then the opposite side will tend to be a little bit in front of that side. The thoracic region, or the space between the shoulder blades and spine, sometimes this is referred to as the interscapular region or the dorsal rostral region. But if you can just imagine where the spine is, that's a straight line down the middle of the back, the middle of the body, and then there's where the inside of the shoulder blade is, there's going to be a little alleyway of the thoracic region there. The more we can get some pressure into either a wall or a ground on that side, we're loading that side a little bit more. And again, that side will be a little bit behind the opposite side to tell us that we're loading more towards that side. If the back of our head is in contact with the ground, a headrest, a wall, then feeling a little bit more pressure towards that side of the head can also help us align everything and create load. So one of the best cues we can have for loading would be, can we align our nose over the middle of our knee, over the middle of our foot, especially when our foot is on the ground. And that gives us a nice little reference for where we're not just moving some parts of the body, but we're moving the body as a whole to load aside. Because what happens oftentimes when we start cueing things individually, yeah, you can feel your outer heel, but your head, if you're feeling your left outer heel, your head's off to the right, and your hips are compensating in a zigzag-like fashion to still allow you to feel that contact, but you're not really actually bringing your body and loading over there. So this combination of cues of pulling yourself to a side and then feeling these contact points to tell us that you've really loaded towards that side become really, really important. Other things we can look at is if we understand where the sternum or the chest bone is and the belly button, generally we want those two areas to be turning toward the side we're trying to load. And then when we think about breathing in this case, we can either think about inhaling more towards the back side of the body. That creates a little bit more loading. Or again, we talked about exhaling to pull us towards that side, but when we're really, really fully loading, we may actually want to then inhale, because the inhale sort of prepares us for coming off the side and unloading or propelling off the side later. So when we think about our inhalation cues, it would be if we have that feeling of the thoracic region being heavier against the wall or the ground, or the back of the belt, the PSIS, being heavier against that contact point. If we inhale, it's like we can breathe into that area more. We create more contact with that surface. We're loading that area more. So you can think of it as you're breathing into the side to load, and then we're going to exhale to propel ourselves away from that side eventually. So references then for unloading would be, as we're loading the outer heel of the side that we're going towards, we were going to come off the side that we're unloading. And by doing that, we're going to move towards the inner arch, big toe of the foot. If our hands are on the ground, and as we load the pinky side of the side we're going towards, then we would move away from the side that we're unloading by moving towards the thumb side of the hand. So again, it's this push-pull relationship. So we pull ourselves towards the outside of the hand and we push away with the inside of the hand. These subtle cues can really, really help to just have the body be in sort of a continuum of weight shifting, that when there's pain involved, that continuum of saying, can we just load one side a little bit more? Maybe the side that you're not having pain, we load that a little bit more and it offloads the side that's having pain. And then there's reasons to do it the other way, but pain can become a nice indicator of how subtle we can be in just kind of offloading a side or loading a side if we need to create a little bit more stability. All right, so the sternum facing away, just like we talked about when we were loading the side, the sternum is going to face towards that side we're loading. The belly button is going to face away, where when it was loading, it was facing towards. The space between the pelvis and ribs on the side that we're unloading is going to be more expanded compared to that loaded side. So we talked about, as we pulled towards, we got those internal obliques on the rib cage and the pelvis on that side came a little bit closer together because that's what the muscle contraction will do on that side. On the other side, even though we are still contracting the external obliques on that side, it's really going to have more of a effect of enhancing or expanding that space where the ribs move a little bit away from the pelvis because we're compressing the other side. And inhalation in this case, if inhalation is going to be the cue that we're going to, we're thinking about inhaling more on the front side of the body. So a good area to focus on would be if you can think about the chest wall, the front of the lung on the side that we're moving away from. As we inflate that, it basically is a pusher and it pushes us more to the side we're trying to load. So as we're unloading, say our right side, we may get more air or more inflation into that front of the chest wall that can help to have us move and compress and load the other side. Exhalation in this case would come into play, as I talked about, when we're inhaling maybe towards the back of the body or cueing the back of the body with our inhalation. As we're coming off that side, we're going to exhale to propel ourselves away from the side. And that becomes really important when we're thinking about propulsion type movements, athletic movements, just even walking. But certainly as things get a little quicker, there's this ability to use the breath to help pressurize our movements and really enhance our power. So some functional examples that I want to break down, and I will put a bunch of videos in the show notes here so you can have a better visual of this. But just so we can take some of these concepts now and put them with specific functional movements and how we can break everything down and how we can look at this. So let's start with walking. Walking is the most important one, I would say, but it's also one of the easiest foundations to break down because everybody's got to walk, but everyone's usually got a little bit of efficiency that might be leaking out of their gait cycle too. So if we break it down, we can also work on trying to improve a lot of things, but everything with walking is a little bit slower. So the way that I break down walking is usually I like to look at 3 different positions. I look at a heel strike where your body is loaded completely over one leg, and then the opposite leg that is unloaded, you just have the heel down, making initial contact with the ground. So that's going to be position 1. So when we're in that position, we can statically look at how are people loading that side that they're loading. So let's say the heel is down on the right, the body weight is loaded on the left. So there's a lot of opportunity there to see, is the head stacked over the shoulders and rib cage and pelvis? Is there appropriate contact that can be found towards the outer heel? So if not, and oftentimes there's not, there's a lack of awareness of how far back or posterior someone could actually bear weight. There's a subtle forward lean that people are taking on a regular basis because our life is forward. Our eyes are forward. We live forward. We move forward. So we don't realize how little awareness we have of what's behind us and how much we can actually shift our weight back a little bit. And that shifting of the weight and giving us more posterior awareness or more ability to shift posterior is really important to give us more out of our rotational cues. Because if we're always, let's say, biasing the front of the foot and we don't even have any experience shifting back into the posterior part of the foot, and then all of those rear cues, the back of the belt, the upper back, if we don't have an awareness of how back they could be without us losing our balance, then we're always a little biased forward, which creates a lot of imbalances, which can be responsible for some pains over time. So starting with just that one position, seeing how well they're stacked over that position, how well they can load over that side. And then if need be, we can use some muscular cues to help them pull into the side a little bit more, maybe push away from the side that's just with the heel strike. So we do that for as long as we need in a static position. Then we can go to the next position, which we go from heel strike to rollover. So with rollover, we've now shifted our loading to the opposite side. So in this example, it'll be to the right side. And as we do that, we now stack the body, head over rib cage, over pelvis, over that right side. As we're doing that, the left leg is still behind, but we have come off that leg. So the only thing in contact with the ground on that left side that we just unloaded will be the ball of the big toe. So we're rolling over the ball of the big toe. The heel comes off, but about 99% of the weight should be on that front leg. So that's the rollover position. So we can look at how are they stacked? How are they loading on that side. Where does the body weight want to go? And if we need to, again, we can use some pulling and pushing cues to get people to feel the relationship of loading and unloading. The third position then would become, after you roll over, you just pick that back leg up that you were just rolling through, and you go into a stance phase, which is be completely a one-legged stance. So just to continue that example, we were loaded on the right, rolled over onto the left. That left foot finally comes off the ground. Now we're completely loaded 100% on the right, but we were seeing how well can we stay stacked over there, how's the balance. And then when we take that left foot off, generally I like to see the left foot in line with the right straight leg. So you make kind of a figure four position. And again, I'll put some videos and pictures in the show notes so that becomes more clear. And then you just cycle through. So from that stance position, that unloaded leg comes forward, makes initial contact and heel strike, and then you load over that leg to roll over, and that becomes the gait cycle. So we start that with just the cues for the lower body, and then we start to get the upper body involved, which would be every time the heel comes down, that unloaded side, the opposite side will reach forward. That creates a reciprocal motion, which creates more rotation in the body. So we have a left heel strike, we'll have a right reach, and then vice versa. And just trying to coordinate that slowly, statically with isometrics for pushing and pulling at first, and then we add some slow motion movement, and then we add some speed to it. And as we add speed, the cueing changes. So now it's not going to become as intense, or there won't be as many cues. We just pick one cue that tends to work for someone. Oftentimes, as we're walking a little bit faster, if we need a little bit more loading to one side, let's say we need a little bit more loading to the left side, I'll just cue left heel, right reach. And we could do that vice versa if we needed a little bit more loading to the opposite side. But we want to just have somebody's awareness be on the left heel while they reach with the opposite side. That reach will push them more to that heel. So oftentimes that could become a really nice cue. The other cue is just to shorten the stride length a lot of times. So once we do these static positions, to look at the stacked body angle, one thing you're going to see right away is you can't stride as much as you would want to stride, because as soon as you overstride, you're going to lose that stacked position. You're falling forward too aggressively. You don't have as much control. If we turn it into a position where we can tap lightly with the heel strike, but also reverse it and bring our foot back, we now have that balance, that stacked position that we're just trying to constantly move over. We're trying to basically fall over positions of support. And that position of support, or the posture of support, is head over rib cage over pelvis as much as possible. So as we slow it down, we really show people that it's a shorter stride than you need. So then as you're walking faster, a nice cue can become quick and light, and then quick and light, left heel, right reach. Or we can have some muscular cues of saying, okay, feel left side abs if we're trying to be a little bit more pulled towards the left side, or if we're trying to bias the right, would be feel more right side abs. So all of the cues that we talked about with pushing and pulling, loading and unloading, we can blend them in as things go from static to slow to fast. So crawling would become the next example that incorporates the upper body. So the contact points that we talked about with the foot, outer heel, rolling over the big toe, you can think about that as a parallel in the hand. So the pinky side of the hand towards the wrist is going to be like the outer heel when we're making an initial contact with our hand to the ground. And then as we're pulling or loading towards that side, the opposite side, we'd be moving through the thumb and the index finger and even the middle finger. So we could think of the thumb, index, and middle finger, especially the index and middle finger, sort of like the big toe rollover. And we would be rolling through that as we're offloading the other side. And so oftentimes those upper body cues with reciprocal motion, as we reach, say, the right hand forward, that's going to bring the opposite knee forward. We'll get these reciprocal motions. But the contact point with the hand, oftentimes it can be quite subtle, but quite powerful. And then where this contact point with the hand comes into play, and it carries over to something like a push-up. Anytime we have our hands on the ground, say we're getting, let's say, right-sided shoulder pain every time we go down and do a push-up, sometimes a cue of just saying, feel a little bit more outer left wrist or towards the pinky side of your left hand as you pull yourself down. Does that help your pain? Does it make it go away? A lot of times it makes some change. And we can have a bunch of different cues that we can use to just offload aside when there's pain involved with a certain movement. And sometimes we actually need to load aside to decrease the pain for a variety of different reasons. with running, we're going to take the concepts that we had with walking, where we had a few positions that we can look at statically, and then we're going to add a little bit more of a dynamic flair to them, and we actually have to, I think, a little bit more about the concept of falling. So my education on running is really shaped by the pose running method, just because I found it to be one of the most simple ways to understand running. Personally, as a runner, I'm not a competitive runner by any means, but to improve my running, but also to carry it over to runners that had injury, so that I could sort of backtrack how they were running and give them some type of feedback where I could see in their process of running, instead of just having them run, but I could break their running down and deconstruct their running into positions and transitions. So what the pose method looks at is just basically three factors. There's a pose or a position that you're going to want to hit every time you load with running. So that basically looks like that stance phase of walking, but the knee is a little bit softer. The opposite foot is sort of pulled up, so it would be in line with the loaded leg. But there, in that first pose position, there is one leg that's loaded, one leg that's unloaded. So it's really a nice starting point, because as you start running, a lot of times things start moving so fast that you really can't have any type of assessment for it. So being able to slow it down and say, okay, there's an initial position that we can assess, and we can see how far people are off or how close they are to it, that can really help us. And a lot of these pushing and pulling, loading and unloading cues come into play. So I've put this in the show notes, as well as some positions of what the pose position looks like. But ultimately, it's head stacked over shoulders or rib cage over pelvis. The foot is loaded, but in this case, we're not going to be outer heel, because we're thinking we're going to be traveling forward. So we're going to be a little bit more on the ball of the foot. The knee is going to be soft, and we're preparing to move forward, while the other foot is in line off the ground and in line with that leg that's loaded. So one of the first things we can look at is, can we own that pose on both sides? Can we shift weight? Can we run in place, where as we run in place, we're always landing in that pose, but we're not moving forward yet? So we're keeping a more vertical orientation. In order to move forward and travel forward, we have to understand the concept of falling and how that works when we travel forward, right? So we're, in some ways, when we're walking, we're still falling. It's just the falling angle is so small that it often doesn't need to be trained in the same way. When we look at running, it really does need to be understood. So if we think about that pose position, that idea of head over rib cage over pelvis, when we think about going forward, we want to keep that orientation. So as our body starts to move forward, we don't want to throw our foot out in front of us and really lose that, and then kind of bow forward and lose that orientation of our head being in a line with our rib cage and pelvis. But we want to think of that vertical line becoming a more diagonal line as we continue to follow that line forward. Now, if we just timber forward, eventually we'd fall on our face. So we have to be able to pull our other foot up quick enough to propel us forward to catch up with our falling angle. All right, so the idea would be, we have this vertical posture that we're then falling forward, and we're making it more diagonal. And as that happens, gravity wants to push us towards the ground. The leg that was the unloaded, or the loaded leg, then has to pull up and then unload while the opposite leg loads. And then there's this reciprocal relationship of loading and unloading, but the cue often becomes pulling the foot off the ground quick enough that we can still maintain our angle of fall. So I think a lot of times that one of the best cues for runners is to think about what's happening at the belt line or at the hips. Lead with the groins, because if we overstride and we throw our leg out, a lot of times our foot goes forward, but our butt goes back, our head goes forward. And if our butt goes back, that means our groins go back, or our belt line goes back. So leading with the groins, and then that will have our stride length change to meet the posture. So we could start with just understanding the posture vertically, but as we start to move forward, we move forward with a short stride, a small stride, small pulls of the feet off the ground. As we go a little bit faster, the cue is not necessarily to throw the feet out in front of you and overstride, but to think about go as fast as you can, like somebody's pushing you from the hips forward, or like somebody's pulling your belt buckle forward, and try to keep up with that by pulling your feet faster, pulling them higher to keep up with that angle of fall. All right, so that becomes a little bit certainly more complex than walking because it's more dynamic, but there is this loading and unloading strategy. The other thing I think that's really important to look at, depending on how fast we're trying to run, the idea of rotation will change quite a bit. So if we're running for a longer period of time, we're trying to jog and we're trying to allow our body to maybe pace itself, we can think about a bigger excursion of rotation. So for instance, as we're running maybe on a treadmill, we're thinking about trying to maintain a more vertical posture. When one side of the body is going forward, we can think about that being more of the reaching side. So we can think about say the right chest wall moving forward. And we can also think about a reference for having the left side of our thoracic spine, the left side of the belt moving back. And then there's this reciprocal back and forth. While one side of the chest wall goes forward, the other side of the thoracic spine goes back. Or our references can be more at the hips, where one knee feels like it goes forward, the other knee feels like it's going back as the foot is pulling up. So that there's these cues for pulling, but then there's also these cues for reciprocal rotation of arm maybe subtly reaching forward, the chest wall going a little bit forward, the opposite side of the thoracic spine or belt line going back. And then there's a back and forth there. So it can be really helpful to have those references in your head. Although running is sort of dynamic and everything's moving really fast, as you're jogging for a longer period of time, it becomes a little bit more rhythmic to have some of those cues in your head. You could also have some muscular cues where, okay, I'm going to subtly feel the left abdomen a little bit more than I normally would because I feel like I need to pull myself to the left. I'm going to feel like I'm maybe pulling up my foot off the ground a little bit quicker than I normally would if I feel like I'm landing too heavy on a side. So there's all these different cues. Again, we can use reaching the right knee tends to be a helpful one that I like to use. If I reach the right knee a little bit more, it helps to get me to the left side a little bit. So if I want to get off my right, I will reach my right knee and I'll feel like I pull up quicker with the left heel towards the butt. And that combination of things helps me feel like I'm loading my left side a little bit more if I need to. And I could just reverse that if I felt like I needed to load the right side. I find that I need to oftentimes bring my attention to loading the left side more. My natural running stride will tend to push me to the right, and I'll fall to the right a little bit more. So hopefully that makes sense. I know that's a difficult thing to be able to listen to, and I will put videos in the show notes to make that make more sense. But there is a way to really break down running that incorporates all these cues of pushing, pulling, loading, and unloading. With cutting, so if we're cutting more laterally, we'll think about side shuffles or just change of direction stuff in a sport like, say, basketball or tennis, where we have to have a lot of lateral movement. The idea of cutting would be, I think it's one of the easier things to feel the difference between loading and unloading, because as we move more laterally, like we're really pulling ourselves to one side more than another, that even more so than when we're, say, falling forward or traveling forward. So the static position that we look at with cutting is something that is called a lateral stance, which we have this orientation again of pulling the nose over the knee, over the middle of the foot. So a good starting position would be start standing upright with the legs spread out, feet pointing forward, and pull yourself to one side, right? So when you stand up and your legs are a little bit wide, your nose, your sternum, your belly button is going to be straight in line with your fly, but your knees and your feet are going to be out lateral from that center line. So if we want to move ourselves to one side, we're going to take the nose, sternum, belly button and try to bring it over the middle of the knee. So if we're moving to the left, we try to bring it over the knee and the middle of the foot to that side. Typically, that's going to correspond to a hip hinge type movement to that side as well. So as I bow forward or as I pull myself to that side, my butt is going to go back and I'll feel like I'm getting hopefully a stretch in the back pocket of the side that I'm moving towards. Again, there'll be videos in the show notes for this, but there's this sense of starting and standing, legs wide, pull yourself over one side while you hinge your hip back so that hip that you have just loaded is now behind the side that you've unloaded, and you feel the stretch in that back pocket. A lot of ways to compensate here. The most common way is to start to move the body towards that side, but your hip starts to kick away, right? So that you don't get that feeling of the stretch in the back pocket that you're going towards, because you might bring your head over, but you side bend and then kind of kick your hip away, and you really aren't offloading that other side quite as well, right? So there should be a feeling of loading through that outer heel, back pocket gets a stretch, nose over knee over middle of the foot. And as you're doing that on the other side, you're offloading the foot. So you're feeling like you're moving towards the inside of the foot. It's another compensation. It's really hard sometimes for people to really let go of the outside of the foot that they're moving away from, because they don't feel quite so stable there. And if you put load through the inside of the foot, if you think about walking on the inside of your foot, it doesn't feel really comfortable, right? If you can visualize anyone who's got a really pronated foot, the problem is not that the foot is pronated. Usually the problem is that the person can't get in and out of pronation and is pronating on the foot or walking on the inside of the foot while they're loading through it. So you want to be putting weight through the inside of the foot while your weight is moving away from it. So not really weight through it, but a contact with the inside of the foot as you're moving off that. And you can use that to kind of help you push even more to the side you're loading. So getting that sense of being able to pull yourself into the lateral stance on both sides, that's a really good starting point. And then as you start to load the side more, the side that's unloaded can really just come off the ground. So it might start with enhancing the movement where you're pushing through the inside of the foot to get you heavier onto the side you're loading. But eventually that side gets so unloaded that you just pick it up. Now you're fully loaded on one side, and you can load that to, say, jump laterally to the other side. Or you load it, imagine that you're doing some type of side to side speed skating type of movement that you load before you really throw the leg out to go in the other direction. So this lateral stance becomes a foundational movement to say, can you get yourself to really load over that side before then you unload and propel back the other way. All right, so this is really, again, helpful to do slow, statically with isometric. Sometimes you got to feel some muscular cues to help you pull towards the side. But then once you feel a little more comfortable with that, you can just add some speed side to side. Then you can add complexity by jumping and landing and see if you can land and still pull yourself into that loaded position. And then eventually it just becomes more, you're not trying to fully load as much. Like, so if you're going into I say like a powerful speed skating style movement where you're really low, you can hang out in the loaded position as long as you want, and then you throw yourself in the other direction. So you powerfully go to the other side, you pause, load, powerfully throw yourself to the other side. That's an easier thing to work on, even though there's a lot of value to that. You're working on power. But now if we say we want to make that movement a little bit quicker, and we don't really want to stop and load as much, just the back and forth, the quick back and forth, there's a lot more propulsion there. We don't go as far to the outer heel. We don't turn and load as much. And it allows us to go back and forth quicker, but it also makes us tend to get tired a little quicker. So when we're thinking about the difference between like sprinting or doing something for a little bit longer, I alluded to this with running, but that there's this idea that we're going to load a little bit less. So the more we load into the ground, the slower we tend to be. But there's always a back and forth in being able to load a little bit and then unload. But the more we're unloading, the more we're propelling, the faster we tend to be, right? And you can think of that as, the less time the feet are in contact with the ground, typically we're going to be a little bit faster. We're more in control of our movement forward. But if the loading can actually give us a little bit of a rest, right? So jogging, they'll tend to be more loading than sprinting. And the same thing with cutting and being really powerful, loading and exploding, versus I'm not going to take a lot of time to load. I'm just quickly moving back and forth. So that gives us a little bit different definition between power and speed as well, where there's going to be a lot more loading and then exploding with power, where with speed, there's not as much loading. It's just a propulsion back and forth. All right, so other movements that we can think of that have these components would be throwing. If you imagine a baseball pitcher, when they're going to load the back leg as they have the front leg wind up and pull up. That's an unloaded leg. As they follow through, now the leg that was drawn up and unloaded becomes the loaded leg. And the more we can get the body to pull towards the back pocket, towards the outer part of that heel, the more ideal and more optimal the motion became, because we were able to get more rotation out of there. And a lot of times a powerful athlete or a good pitcher with great mechanics can utilize the rotation, the falling, to get more out of themselves so that they don't have to use as much powerful muscular effort. There's certainly going to be plenty of powerful muscular effort there, but the more that you're able to utilize that whip of the rotation, the more effortless the action becomes. And then anything you can add on top to that from a powerful muscular endeavor just enhances it. So that's why you often see a lot of different body types in the throwing sports and swinging sports. Is a long body tends to be better at rotating and better at using that angular momentum of being able to get from one side fully to the other side, and really takes advantage of those mechanics, where sometimes you have someone who can't turn as well. They're a little bit more stout, but they could just drive through their legs like crazy. So, you see different things. Ultimately, you want something in between for performance, is that you have as much drive as you can without losing the angular mechanics that you'd be getting from optimizing rotation. So all of these movements that you'll see in sport, if you can kind of watch them with these cues and these references in your head, I think you can look at them from a different perspective. So hopefully that was useful. Again, I'm going to have a lot of videos in the show notes here. Please ask me questions, give comments about stuff that wasn't clear, and I'll do more stuff, or I can do a session individually with you, or do a video for you individually to enhance some of the concepts here. I'll see you next time.